Welcome to the Small Giants Fishbowl. This topic is a strengths-based culture, boosting your people and your profits. A Gallup Certified Strengths Coach and founder of Flourish LLC, as she introduces you to the productivity and profitability effects of building a strengths-based organization. Okay, here we go.
Hello, everybody. Welcome. I hope that Hans and I were chatting a little bit earlier that Mother Nature seems to have maybe had one too many libations this spring. We are finally starting to calm down here in Dallas, so I hope that's the case for you, because whoa, been a spring. I'm really excited that you're here. Like she said, as we're going through the presentation, I have a couple of points in my slides where we'll stop and kind of breathe for a second, and you can ask some specific questions during those times. But if something comes up as I'm speaking, absolutely put your question in the chat. I'd love to answer them as we go through, just so that your question is answered during the moment of that specific subject. So feel free to ask away. And on that, we're going to go ahead and get started. So this webinar is about building a strengths-based culture in your organization, and kind of what all goes into that. So if that has to do with you understanding your strengths a little bit more, understanding the strengths of your employees a little bit more, and then how do you really make that a culture in your organization? So that's where we're going to go. Okay, so some specifics about today. I'm going to do a little personal introduction to give you some more idea of who I am and kind of what my background on strengths is. We're going to talk about why it's important to focus on strengths. And I know that sounds a little bit odd, but I have a couple of kind of thought processes to lead you through that actually really highlight how we tend to be weakness fixing focused instead of focused on our strengths. So I want to highlight that. I'm going to go into depth about the CliftonStrengths assessment, because I think that most people end up taking CliftonStrengths and getting their results and then kind of moving forward a little bit, but don't necessarily have a ton of background about how that assessment began and some of the data behind it. And I think that can be really helpful. And then we're going to talk the majority of the presentation about strengths-based management, because that's really the key factor in creating a strengths-based culture. It comes from the management. So that will cover perception of strengths, evaluative environments. So if you are in a position or individuals in your organization are in a position where you're evaluating employees, performance management, what does that look like? How can strengths be involved? Job roles and strengths. That's one of the biggest questions I get is, what's the right position for someone with achievers? So we're going to talk about that. And then the last is really some steps on incorporating strengths culture into the workplace. So after we've kind of talked about what that culture looks like as a whole, what are some specific small steps that you can start to take to do that? So just before I get started, I'm curious to know, and you can just kind of wave your hand a little bit, who has taken Clifton Strengths Finder and has their top 5 or their full 34 list? Either one, just kind of wave. Amsa, can you give me like what does it look like?
Looks like maybe half the crowd.
All right, awesome. Okay, good. That's good. That's really helpful. I have really kind of constructed the presentation from the perspective of not having taken Strengths Finder, but because around half of you maybe have, I'll put in some other specific examples to kind of help a little bit. So, okay. So we'll talk about me first. Just a blank screen. Pretty much it. Who's kidding? All right. So prior to being a Strengths Finder coach, I was in university administration for about 11 years. Worked in Florida International University, Creighton University of Texas at Austin, and Middle Tennessee State, and loved my experience. And that's actually where I was introduced to Strengths Finders through higher education. Universities and colleges are typically big fans of strengths. and that mindset, and a lot have really started to use them in career centers to help students figure out what makes them a little bit different and unique and how they can incorporate that in their job search process, and finding a major, things like that. So that's where my introduction came from. And even though I had different positions within university administration, strengths kind of just always found its way into my position, either using those to have a conversation with a student or with a colleague, or with somebody that I supervised. And that was kind of that common thread that really pulled through. So at one point I kind of jumped off the side of the mountain and decided that I was going to create a business using strengths coaching and be able to go into organizations and really help them understand the benefits that can happen when you kind of change your mindset to a strengths-based culture. So Flourish LLC is my organization, and I think it's important to give you just an idea of kind of what I do, because as we go through this, that might help craft some of your questions. So executive and managerial coaching is a big part of my business, specifically though mid-level managers. You guys are my favorites. So if we have mid-level managers in here, I'm speaking to you, because I think that is a level of management within kind of that journey, that scope, that a lot of mid-level managers end up kind of feeling like they're kind of left out to dry, right? So it's not super often that you enter a management position and be able to have a wealth of management training to kind of go with that role. So a lot of folks who are in that mid-level position are trying to find their way. They've managed for a little bit of time. Maybe they've emulated somebody else's style, and now they're trying to figure out their own. And so when I'm able to work with someone in that position and help you learn to bring strengths into that management style, then that's a real game changer. And then team development workshops, that's kind of my sweet spot. That's what I really, really, really love to do, is come into organizations and help really spark that strengths movement. So if that's through workshops and retreats, one-on-one coaching with employees, there's a variety of different ways, but that's kind of my favorite thing. So, all right. Okay, so why a strengths focus? I want you to think for a minute about maybe when you were in, we'll say, third grade. For some folks, that might be a bit of a stretch back, but that's okay. Everyone's muted, so no one has to know. So I want you to think back to that time period, and let's say you got your report card that you needed to take home to your parents or grandparents or guardian, and on that report card you had, we'll say, an A in math, a B in science, a B in history, and a C- in English. Okay, so you're going home and you're thinking about giving this report card to your parents or your grandparents, your guardian. What, after they read that report card, what do you think the first thing that they're going to point out on the report card is going to be? English, right? Absolutely. That C-, that, okay, look at C-, what happened in English? I don't know if anybody got that like comment. What happened in, right? We as a culture really in America, but Gallup's data spans way past America and goes worldwide. We tend to take our immediate focus into an area of weakness, a deficit for ourselves, right? Okay, I have a C- in English. Like, how can I build that back up? I'm obviously struggling in there. I need to work on that more. But we don't really take time to notice that A in math, right? That was a natural area of strength for you in that report card, per se. Definitely not mine. But you look at that, instead of, parents or guardians saying, we probably need to spend some time in English, right? Because the C- in English is going to cause some problems maybe later on in getting into college or, something specific. But an A in math, what kind of new opportunities can we give you to really use that natural strength, right? How can we apply something that's already really natural for you, because that's where the most growth is going to come from. So I have a baseball pitcher up here because I think one of the best images that I've come up with that will really help folks understand and grasp the idea of why it's important to focus on our strengths is, if you think of a pitcher, we'll say major league pitcher, okay? So a major league pitcher needs to know how to throw several different kinds of pitches, right? Fastball, curveball, okay? If he throws a curveball, and it's okay, it's not great, but his fastball cannot be beaten, right? It's awesome. He can spend some time doing the curveball and working on it, because a major league pitcher needs to know how to do that, right? And have that in his back pocket. But the curveball isn't going to win the game. The fastball is going to win the game, right? So that natural strength, putting more effort and energy into that, is really what's going to end up taking him way into productivity, way into what's going to work best and actually win those games. And so that's why it's really important for us to take that strengths focus, really looking at managing maybe some deficits of ours, but putting our energy into what our natural strength is. Okay, so a question that I get pretty regularly about this is, what are the odds for my strengths? So there are 34 in the Gallup CliftonStrengths assessment. We'll talk about kind of what that looks like in a little bit. But often I get the question of, well, what are the odds that somebody has my same? Like, how unique am I actually? Okay. You're just more so than a snowflake. All right. So same top 5 in any order. So let's say you and another person have the same top 5 strengths after you've taken the assessment. What do you think the odds are? 1 in 285,000. So that's the odds that somebody else around here has taken the assessment, has the same top 5 strengths as you, but just kind of in a different order. Same top 5 in the same order is 1 in 33 million, which is crazy, right? So that is, and order matters. They're in a rank. So that top strength is the most influential. It influences all of your others. So order matters. So 1 in 33 million that somebody has the same top 5 in the same order as you. And then just take a guess, if you got your entire 34 ranking, what the odds would be that someone would have your same full 34 ranking is 1 in 474 billion, which means there's literally not another human being on the planet who thinks exactly like you do, which is great. And why it's so important that we take the time to really invest in our strengths and understand them and understand how they work, and how they present themselves and the strengths of those around us, right? Because we are all going to contribute something so unique and so different, that if we're taking more time to figure that out, it becomes our fast pitch. Okay, so the DNA. Gallup started this strengths movement a while back, but it came from about 4 decades of research. And they were researching it with a population of about 2 million people, which I can't even imagine, but it's Gallup, so they can do it. And they were actually, when this whole strengths movement began and the research began, they were working on answering the question, what makes some people more productive in the workplace than others? So that was actually kind of what started this. And the result was that the people that were more productive in their workspace were the ones that understood what their strengths were, and they were utilizing those in the workplace. They were putting to work. And the managers in those locations knew the strengths of their employees and were also engaging those. So obviously before the assessment came out, they didn't have the vernacular, they didn't have this vocabulary for those 34 strengths, but in general, their mentality was that they understood what their strengths were, and that they were really utilizing them. So the assessment, a lot of people, I think, sometimes get confused. You have StrengthsFinder, you have Myers-Briggs, you have DISC, you have True Colors, right? There's a huge breadth of assessments out there. StrengthsFinder is a little bit different because it is not a personality assessment. So StrengthsFinder it assesses your pattern of thought. So how you approach new situations and how you approach new knowledge and how you interact with others, basically how you kind of perceive the world around you. Your personality can influence those strengths, right? But this is about your pattern of thought. Okay. So we'll kind of come back and mention that quite a bit in the presentation, because I want you to be thinking about strengths as how you think and not necessarily what your actual personality is. Okay, so those of you who have taken the assessment, the screen might look familiar. Those of you who have not, this is an example of what the output would be. So when you take the assessment, you are actually ranking, your answers are ranking the full list of 34 strengths. So I know sometimes people will look at the list of strengths and the definitions and say, I promise you, I do not have empathy. I promise you it's not in there. It is. It's absolutely there. It might be number 34, but it's definitely there. So we all have all 34 strengths. And I say that I think because sometimes we can kind of playing around in our heads a little bit and think like, well, you know, in my top 5, I don't have any kind of relationship building strengths. I don't have empathy or includer or harmony, right? Or something. And it kind of messes with our brains a little bit. We have all 34 strengths. The results that you get are ranking. You have 2 options, by the way, when you take the assessment to get your top 5 and to get the full 34. I get questions about that a lot. My suggestion as a coach, just for what it's worth, is to start with your top 5. You can go back and release the rest of your list at any time if you would like to do that. But I always suggest starting with just this top 5, and that's because of that mental image of the grades, right, that we had at the very beginning. So if a lot of times, if you release that full 34 list right off the bat, you get your results and you're looking at them, where are you going to go first? 34. Absolutely, hands down, right? You're going to skip over the top, go straight down to the bottom, and be thinking like, well, how do I, surely I'm strategic. I mean, I have to have, right? And you start kind of trying to do that weakness fixing, that deficit fixing, instead of looking at those top 5 first. So I think it's really helpful for most people to really just take the top 5 at first and focus on those, learn about them, understand what they look like in how you interact with others. And when you really can claim those top strengths and see them as your own, then release the full 34 list. And that'll really help you to kind of process the rest of your results. Okay, the same old thinking gives you the same old results. This is actually a good thing in the strengths world. Thomas and I were talking at the beginning about probably the most frequent question that I receive about strengths is, are my strengths going to change if I take the assessment again, right? So for most people, your top 9, 10, 11, 12 strengths, somewhere between that 9, 10, 11, those top typically will not change. There might be some movement within that top 10 for you based on life experiences, or if you are, you know, kind of in a new stage of life that's a little bit different, you might be calling on some other in that top 10 than maybe the previous time you took it. But generally for most people, those top 10 or so strengths don't change. You just might have some movement within those, depending on kind of what stage of life that you're in. So I think that's kind of helpful. Usually for most people also, the first time you take the assessment is the most accurate. And that's because you don't have any bias at that point. You have no idea what you're doing, right? Like you don't know what these words are. The assessment's a little bit crazy. And so you tend to answer more from gut. Whereas if you know your top 5, or maybe you've done a little bit of strengths development, when you take it again, you naturally start to read into questions. And your answers, your gut answer might change. So my biggest suggestion is always really go off of that first time that you took the assessment, but knowing that if you take it again and you have a little bit of change in movement, those top 10 are probably all the same. You are you, just with a little bit of variance. Okay, I will be referring to these as strengths throughout the presentation. But in reality, I think it's important to note that they are not yet strengths for any of us. These are themes, they're talents, they're general ways in which we think and process, but we have not built them into talents. They're more in a raw state when you first take the assessment. So much like this kind of small plant and tree that you see on there when we first take our strengths, we're in that raw zone, right? So if you walked into Lifetime Fitness and signed a contract, you don't walk out the door completely toned. It would be really nice if that were the case, but that's not the case, and also not the case with strengths. Okay, so you build muscle tone over time by investing in that and learning about how to do that correctly and taking the time. Exact same thing with strengths, right? They're just general themes of talent when we start. But when we start to learn what their tendencies are and what really great environments and situations to put our strengths in so that they start to mature, then that's when they really do become strengths. Like I said, I'm going to call them strengths in here because that goes with the name of Strengths Finder, and it typically is easier for people to process. But the idea is that we're building them into strengths. All right, little check-in. See if everybody's with me and okay. Are there any questions so far as we are kind of processing through? No? Good? All right.
Keep going. Yep.
Let's do it. Okay, managers, I'm gonna need you to take a deep breath, okay? Because this next stat is scary, and I just need everybody to kind of process and be prepared, okay? You with me? Grab the little paper bag, it'll be fine. Okay, 70% of the variance in employee engagement across business units is attributable to managers. What does that mean? That means you influence 70% of an employee's experience in their job. That is crazy, right? Huge. And just to kind of note, as we're going through this, the majority of the statistics that are in my presentation come from a document that Gallup has released called The State of the Workplace. You can download it from their website. I highly recommend it. It's huge. It's a beast of a document, but it is filled with new trends for employees in America, which is incredibly helpful, especially if you're a CEO or a manager of a larger group. Focuses on the needs of millennials as they're now going to be becoming the larger part of the workforce and what that means for your business. So just a plug for that, it's called The State of the Workplace. You can get it on Gallup's website, but I highly recommend. Okay, so because of the value and influence that you have on an employee's experience, 70%, this idea of becoming a strengths-based culture depends on you. That's going to come from you. So the most successful businesses that I've worked with when it comes to integrating a strengths culture, the buy-in comes from the leadership. It starts with the leadership. It's an investment in understanding, I need to figure out what my strengths are and what they look like. How are they perceived by others? You know, when do I let them kind of go haywire and crazy? And when am I able to really focus them? Because you are going to be influencing that same experience of your employees. So really taking the time to understand what your own strengths are and what they look like is going to be a huge part of that strengths culture success. Okay, so when it comes to integrating strengths and building a strengths-based culture from the management perspective, I think there are really four areas that I'm going to focus on, I think, that are most influential. Perception of strengths, I just talked about that for a minute. That's how you are perceiving yours, how others are perceiving your strengths, and how you're perceiving your employees' strengths. Lots of perception. Evaluative environments, I think there is a really great way to include strengths in your evaluation process with your employees. So if that comes to looking at their job skills, if that comes to what their specific role is and how their strengths fit into that role, even evaluations that are a little more developmental, right? So they're not everything's positive in that evaluation. How can you incorporate strengths in a positive way into that kind of conversation? I think that's huge. Job roles and strengths. Another huge question that I get all the time that I referenced before is, what if my strengths are horrible for my job? So I want to talk about that because that's a huge point of misconception for most people. And so we're definitely going to spend some time on that. And then the last is strengths integration in the workplace. So I have some specific things that I think are really helpful for really bringing in strengths to the workplace little bit by bit. So some larger initiatives, even down to really small things that you could do today if you wanted to. Okay, so the perception of strengths, balconies, and basements. That's kind of where we're going to start. Okay, so like I talked about before, we have all of our strengths are kind of on this continuum of being raw and mature, right? And there could be some ebb and flow, but when we're first learning about our strengths, they're definitely in that raw state. And I want to kind of give an example of what that looks like. So this match here, I think, is a really good representation of the strength activator. And if you have taken that, taken the assessment activators in your top 5, whoop, whoop. I'm a huge fan of that. Well, I love them all actually, but anyway, I want to talk about activator and give you an example of kind of what a mature state of that strength would be and what a raw state of that strength would be. So raw would be an activator kind of ready, fire, aim. Okay, so they really are great at sparking new initiatives and acting immediately and jumping into something and deciding that they're going to learn along the way. And so raw state, remember, that's a pattern of thought, looking for action, you know, knowing that action is going to get somebody to the next step quicker. So the raw state of that strength would be kind of jumping into projects with no background, maybe with no research, right? And just kind of jumping in. You know, if you were in a CEO level and activators in your strength, that could make some of your employees a little bit itchy, right? Because you kind of jump in to things, right? That's that raw state. A mature state of activator would be knowing and understanding that that's where your tendency goes and looking for specific locations that need some action, right? If there's a committee that's just sort of been brainstorming for 5 months and no action is coming from it, that's a great place to use that activator strength to really get them to start making some action items, to really start acting on things that they've been brainstorming on. So that would be a mature example of that strength, knowing that you have the ability to see ways that you can act and move forward in something and putting yourself in situations correctly that allow you to do that. So, okay, so strengths perceptions in the workplace. So our perceptions are built on those raw and mature states of strengths, right? A strength by itself is not, it's neutral. There's not a bad side to a strength or a good side. There's not a strength that is bad and one that's good. They're all neutral, but it's what level we are in our development of that strength, whether we're in that raw or mature level. That's kind of where those perceptions generally come from for ourselves and for others. So how do you kind of work on those perceptions in the workplace? Identifying your balconies and basements. Okay, so raw and mature, you could also look at that as being balconies for strengths and basements for strengths. Okay, the view is always the best from the balcony, right? So we always want to be working towards putting our strengths in positions that are allowing them to really grow and be useful and help our colleagues and those that we supervise to be in really powerful and progressive environments. Basements would be hindering that, right? That would be like that activator, just kind of, oh, that sounds like fun, let's go do that, right? And not really thinking about how something is going to affect the business if you decide to jump into that new initiative. So first thing that I think is really helpful is yourself as an employee or a manager or CEO, or if you're an employee and don't have a management position, is to look at what the balconies and basements are of your own specific strengths. What do they look like, right? How are others perceiving those in you? Revealing our own biases. I will tell you, there are some strengths, now that I have been coaching for a while, I can certainly coach someone through the strength strategic. I can help them understand that strength better. I can help them find new ways to integrate that into their specific position. But I don't, deep down in the depths of my head, understand it. I just do not. Strategic is my number 34 way down at the bottom. I am the last person to figure out the plot of a movie. Like, it just doesn't, I'm not there. In fact, I still don't understand the Matrix, just so that, you know, if we're all being honest. But revealing our own biases. So because I know that strategic is not a strength that I naturally understand its tendencies, I could have some natural biases to that, right? Thinking that they always just want to like come in and tell me exactly the plan that I need to take because it's the best one. And why can't they just let me figure it out on my own? And okay. So if you are in a work environment where you're starting to kind of butt heads with some folks, and you're looking at those strengths, really be honest about what your own strengths biases are. So which strengths do you really not understand, and encouraging employees to do the same. Again, in that same thread, seeking to understand, I think we could all agree that most situations, most problems, most challenges in the workplace can, if they can't be solved, they can certainly have some progressive movement with dialogue, with conversation. And strengths is no different. So this concept of really dialoguing and having open conversation about strengths and seeking to understand them. So like I said, I don't naturally think in that strategic mindset at all. I'm as far from it as you could possibly be. But I constantly ask individuals who have strategic in their top 5 about what that strength looks like. You know, how would you approach this problem? And I'm having a hard time figuring something out. Can you use your strategic? Can you help me look at a new path maybe that we can take? And then shaping the perception of others. You have control over the perception of others when it comes to your strengths, a large amount of control. So a lot of that comes from out balconies and basements of knowing, how are my strengths operating right now? You know, if people are having a hard time with how quickly I'm making decisions, maybe my activator strength is hanging out in the basement a little bit. Maybe I'm not really thinking about what all needs to go into decision that we're moving forward with. And, you know, maybe people are seeing that basement of my strength a little bit more than the balcony. And what can I do to really start to put myself in good environments and situations to use that correctly? Okay. And a little, we'll take a little kind of gauge for a second. Are there any questions as we're kind of moving along? I feel like I'm sort of flying, so let me know. Good?
Keep it going.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay, so strengths development in evaluative environments. This section is a little bit tricky, to be honest, because I think that sometimes I've seen a natural path that employers can sometimes take with strengths is to use the strengths culture, the strengths movement as a weakness finder. And by that, I mean saying, you know, well, you're not really great at this specific job function, and I think it's because you don't have XYZ strength in your top 5, right? Definitely not the kind of evaluation conversation that you want to have around strengths. So we're going to talk about that a little bit, but that's why I feel like there's some great growth opportunities in evaluation conversations. In the past, American workplace has really focused on a performance management perspective when it comes to evaluations of employees. You know, really looking at how have you done and leaving it mainly in that area. But as millennials are now taking the majority of the workforce and baby boomers are starting to retire or have already retired, millennials, that generation wants a more professional and personal development plan in the workplace than Gen Xers and baby boomers have had in the past or have wanted in the past. And so that being the case, evaluations are a great opportunity to use strengths to really change your mindset from performance management to performance development, and leaving those evaluation conversations with, okay, what next, right? What's our goal to work towards, and how can your strengths help you to get to that point? So the first way I think to do that in kind of that evaluation setting is establishing expectations. So 6 out of 10 employees know what's expected of them in their job. It's better than 50%, so that's good. But if you think of knowing your job responsibilities, seems pretty basic, right? That you would think it would be closer to 9 out of 10, if not 10 out of 10 people going to their position know what's expected of them that day, what they need to get done, and what that expected level of performance is. But only 6 out of 10 know. And so I think this is a good place to start with strengths. And in that, the next time that you're having one-on-one conversations with employees, take time to go through the job expectations and help them look at their top 5 strengths and figure out how those different strengths can help them achieve success in their different job functions. That's a great way to be able to use strengths in a positive environment, but also really helping employees to get a good foundation, knowing what's expected of them in the workplace, and knowing that not only here are your expectations, but here's how you can do them really well using strengths and talents that you have that nobody else does, right? And helping them tailor their job specifically to what their strengths are. The second way, I think, in evaluation conversations to really use strengths and promote that performance development is continually coaching. Now, I definitely a lot of times will get from managers like, I'm not a coach, right? I'm a manager. I didn't go through coaching. You are kind of a coach, even if you didn't go through some coaching development or certifications or something like that. People today, the statistics, the majority of the workforce in America, they want a coach. They don't want a manager. And so that's the reality of 2018. And so what can you do to get there? Well, you don't have to know what questions to ask in a meeting with an employee to coach them. And I feel like me saying that really basically says that I don't have to know what I'm doing to do my job. And so I probably shouldn't have said that, because now I feel a little bit, you do, you have to know. Okay. So 20% of employees say they've had a conversation with their manager in the last 6 months about goals. That's so low, right? So remember I said the majority of the workplace right now, the millennials who are taking over the majority of the workforce, they want performance development, right? But only 20% are saying that their supervisor in the last 6 months has had a conversation about goals, about development. So how do you incorporate strengths into that conversation? I think the best way and the easiest way is to go back to some of those job expectations and look at those and using some of those and those goals as kind of the starting point. So if you're having one-on-ones with employees once a month or once every 2 months, if you are looking at their goals and saying, well, what level do you feel like you're achieving with this goal? Do you think you're halfway there? What steps have you taken? If they say, I haven't done anything with that goal, I feel really stuck. All you as an employer or manager have to do is look at someone's strengths and just say, well, let's look at your strengths. Which ones do you think are really helping you achieve that goal, or which ones are not? What are some things that we could come up with, some tasks that we could come up with to help you achieve that goal that would really ignite those strengths that you would get a lot of energy from and excitement from? That's that continually coaching. It's kind of sad that there are just not a lot of management positions in the US that are solely focused on managing, right? It's very rare for me to find a manager and that's their sole responsibility. For most of us, you have an entire full-time job of doing something and you also manage your people. Okay, so I totally understand that retort back of, but when am I supposed to have all these coaching conversations with my employees, right? The first step is setting up a consistent time frame to meet with folks. And that's not like 2 hours every meeting, right? You can have a really great short coaching conversation with somebody in 30 minutes, just going back through those goals or those job expectations that you create and say, okay, these are going really well. What's one that's causing you some problems? Let's look at your strengths. Okay, you have learner. I think maybe you're having a hard time with this specific job function because you don't really know what to do, and we haven't given you the opportunity to try it out, right? We haven't given you the go-ahead to say, why don't you go online and see what some other people are doing? Or why don't you try and come up with a new concept on your own? Because learners love that. They love to get their hands in there and figure something out on their own. And so that continually coaching part is just short burst conversations regularly that you can have with employees to help them figure out how to use their strengths more productively in the workplace. And then the third is creating accountability. So employees are 2 times as likely to be more productive in their jobs if they contributed to their performance metrics, right? And that's that very first one, that number one, establishing expectations, having that conversation with them, right? And allowing them to really put their strengths into those job functions. They had some development in that. So then when it comes time to create that accountability or have accountability conversations about strengths, they took part in that process. And so it's more personal, right? There's more personal development to that. That's more coaching than managing. It's more performance development instead of performance management. Okay.
Heidi, just, yep. Okay, good spot right here. Okay. So there was a question on, can you share some resources to help someone shift from a management to a coaching mindset?
Mm-hmm. I can. Truthfully, the best one, I think, is that State of the Workplace, Gallup State of the Workplace report. And I say that because, it has data in it, obviously, but I think that the data that they have gathered about the current state of the workplace will help you understand the basic needs of employees right now, and how simple that coaching conversation can really happen. So I think, kind of like I've alluded to before, that when I suggest to managers, to shift to more of a coaching conversation, to more of a performance development standpoint, it's kind of like, you're asking me to change everything we've already done, right? Like, this is the way we do things. But it can be started in really smaller steps. And I think that document specifically will really help you to understand the purpose behind needing to change to performance development. And that's a really great first step. I'm also going to make a little note of that, because I know I have some other resources that I think would be helpful that I don't have off the top of my head. And so we'll be able to, whoever had asked that question, my contact information will be up afterwards. So please absolutely email me, and I can send you some more that way too. Mm-hmm. Good question.
And then just to follow up on a little bit more specific, was also how to stop solving problems for example, the people or your team members, and getting them to shift so they could solve their own.
Right. How nice would that be? Yeah. Okay. So some of that is coming from helping folks understand and engage their strengths a little bit more. And I think a lot of that comes from building that knowledge. So something I'm also going to share, I think there's going to be some follow-up after this webinar on Monday, where I'll have some resources for you. And in that is going to be a link to podcasts that Gallup puts out on each of their strengths. They are immensely helpful. And I am talking about that specifically with this question because the more knowledge that employees or colleagues are gaining on their strengths, the more confidence that they start to have in understanding their strengths and how to actually use them. And that, when people start to develop that understanding, that education about their strengths and how they can utilize them and what they look like when they're in that balcony level, typically in that situation, then they have more or are more inclined to show some initiative when it comes to doing some specifics in their position or roles in their position. But if they don't understand their strengths, if they're not taking, that there's not encouragement from management or other colleagues to really dive into those and understand them some more, then they're not going to take that initiative, right? Because what's it going to mean to them if we say to them, hey, I know you're kind of having a problem getting started and excited about this one job function. Why don't you use your achiever? It's not going to do anything. They're not going to understand what that means and be motivated to do that. So education and knowledge about our strengths really helps with folks getting excited and ignited and ready to be more proactive with what they do. Good? All right. Okay, job roles and strengths. So like I said before, this is really the area that I get the most questions, especially in one-on-one coaching. So I do some executive managerial one-on-one coaching, and all the times, especially from folks who are just not, they're in a rut in their job. They're not in an excited place in their job. And so the first question they ask when they come in is, I don't think this is the right job for my strengths. So what's the right job for my strengths? And the answer is, everybody say it with me now, there is no right role for a strength. I'm going to say it one more time, mainly because I just really enjoy the text coming up as I speak, because I feel really powerful that way. So there is no right role for a strength. There is not. There is not a perfect strengths combination for a nurse. There's not a perfect strengths combination for a male person. There's not a perfect job for someone whose strengths are all in the relationship building category. There's just not. So our strengths are the how, they're not the what. And if you are taking notes, if you're a note-taking person, that is worth writing down, okay, to remember and commit to memory. Strengths are the how, they're not the what, okay? So your strengths will dictate and indicate how you are going to do a specific job, but not what job you're supposed to actually have. So I'll give you an example. These two strengths, so context and learner. Let's say, for example, you have an employee, or you yourself are responsible for coming up with a log that tracks customer interaction. Okay, so that's what you're being charged with. You need to create this log, right? A context, someone who has context in their top 5, that strength is about looking behind and seeing how things were done in the past, the history behind something. They're really energized by understanding what happened. So a context is probably, in that instance, going to research past processes for a foundation, right? They're going to ask questions to their employer like, well, have we created these logs before? If we did, where are they? What do they look like? Who did them? Okay, so they're asking questions in that context form, because in order for them to feel really confident and comfortable moving forward, they're going to rely on that strength to build a knowledge base of what has been done in the past. A learner probably isn't going to do that. Learners are about excitement for gaining new skills, but really hands-on, right? So they're not as energized by attending a webinar. Sorry, learners. Although you're really excited, I'm sure, gathering new information. But more excited about actually trying things out on their own, getting in there and figuring things out with their hands. Okay, so a learner is probably going to look up different example processes and then try it out, right? Just open Excel, check out a couple things on YouTube, and then start figuring out, well, let's try this one and see it, right? They get more excitement, they get more confidence in what they're doing based on actually getting into it and starting it. So that's kind of the mentality I want you to really take away from this personally as an employer or a manager, but also thinking about how others, how your employees, how your colleagues, those that you work with, that's the mentality. It's not someone being right or wrong for a specific job. It's how they do it. Their strengths dictate how they see their roles and the actions that they take because of their strengths. So now, that being said, I do think it's important to note that there can be some job responsibilities that you want to look for with different strengths if you happen to be doing a job search. So for example, if you are a woo, any woos in the house? Woos always like to absolutely yes. I'm a woo. So woo is actually an acronym. It stands for winning others over. And they love to be around other people. They can very easily engage in conversations with people that they don't know, and get energized by that and learning something new and making a connection with someone else. So if woo is in your top 5, if you were looking at a job description and in that job description it says you will have little to no contact with other people for 90% of this position, that one's probably not for you. Okay, so you can see where the job itself doesn't, you shouldn't look at a specific job just based on your strengths, but look at tendencies in those job description pieces as a whole. So knowing that, you know, you have woo and maybe another relationship building strength, those mean that you need to be around other people. That's part of your pattern, your thought process. You know, how you learn, how you move forward is through others. And so if you're in a job that doesn't give you any access to anybody, that might be a little bit rough for those strengths. Okay, and then incorporating strengths into the workplace. So this is the last section, and really where the majority of the kind of fun in starting a strengths organization comes from. I think there are 3 kind of bigger areas where you can begin incorporating strengths into the workplace. Like I said before, the best and most successful organizations that have become strengths-based cultures, it began with the leadership. And by that, I mean, not a rollout of strengths to the whole organization at one time, but first focusing on the leadership group. That leadership group takes the assessment. They do a retreat or workshop or a couple of development sessions together and really start to understand their own strengths and how, as a leadership group, their strengths work together and lead the organization. So that way, when strengths rolls out to the rest of the employees, they can act not necessarily as, you know, a full coach, but they can help to mentor their employees through that process, and show excitement and initiative for becoming strengths-based and recognizing the unique opportunities and mindsets that your employees are bringing. So starting with leadership is key, I think, in my coaching opinion. Okay, so the first way in incorporating, and my suggestion is a strengths kickoff event. And that can look really different for a lot of different organizations. It just kind of depends on what's the right fit for you. So I have worked with organizations that have had the flexibility of doing like a full day or 2 days of a retreat and kind of temporarily halting business for a minute to really dive deep with strengths right off the bat. Some organizations can just get 2 hours free, right? Or just 4 hours free. It kind of depends on time of year, what, you know, your division has going on. But that's the best way to get everybody on board immediately, and really starting the spark of a strengths-based culture is a kickoff event of some kind. The next way that I think you can start to build your strengths-based culture is through daily and weekly reminders of strengths. So on the right, you'll see this is something that I provide clients to be able to use, you know, however they want to. Kind of blocked off their last name there. That's why that very awkward black rectangle is in there. But really putting out there visually for employees what their personal strengths are so that they can start to memorize them and look at them and, you know, invest in them, but also those of their colleagues and making it really present for everyone. So sometimes that's in email signatures. You'll see that people will start to put their strengths in their email signature when they send that out. I have worked with organizations who have sent like a weekly email to everybody on Monday morning, highlighting a specific strength that week. Hey, this week, we're all going to commit to learning a little bit more about adaptability, right? And here are the employees that have adaptability in their top 5 in our organization. Maybe spend some time asking them some questions this week about what that strength feels like and what it looks like. Here's a podcast for adaptability. We'd encourage everybody to listen to that podcast this week sometime. So those kind of weekly blasts I've seen work really well, especially going through, really focusing on one strength a week, and building your understanding and being able to focus on something specifically tends to also help employees remember the strengths of their colleagues as well. Knowing that this week we're focusing on adaptability, and Bob and John and Mark all have that strength. It kind of commits it to memory a little bit. A shout out program I've also seen where employees have kind of had a wall or an area where they can go and put a strength shout out for another colleague. That's been really neat too. So, hey, I saw Haley today. She used her harmony this way and it was awesome. And I really saw it make a big difference for us and bringing two other individuals to a consensus. And it was great. So that's validation for the employee with that strength, because they're able to really see that they're starting to use it in that mature way, but also helps others to start to learn how to recognize strengths. And when that happens, when employees are starting to be able to recognize what strengths look like, that's when strengths-based culture is really beginning to take place. Because in that moment, when like me, for example, if I know a ranger is another one that's really low for me, it's very difficult for me to figure out the best process of ways that is more productive to get things done. So if I do this first, then this will come easy. Then I can do this one next. And right, my to-do list is just haywire crazy. So if I go to somebody with a ranger, my sister, for example, is a ranger and can say, hey, I need to get all of this done. I don't know the best way to do that. But I know she has a ranger, then that's a really great way for her to be able to use that strength, and me to lean on somebody else's top 5 when I know that that's a deficit for me. And then visually apparent. So I kind of mentioned that before, when people are, when they have their strengths on their email signature, for example, that's, a way that they're seeing it all the time. These pictures are from a current client of mine, and I just love it. I think it was great. They took an entire wall in their business and put every employee's strengths up on the wall. It was a location in the building that most of them walk through or by pretty regularly. And I thought it was great. It was visual. People see it all the time. It was a really great way for people to commit other strengths to memory. And then just recognizing what makes that organization unique. So what makes things a little bit different for them. So I thought that was a really great way. Okay. So kind of one thing before I open it up for more questions that I want to leave with, that I didn't really talk about in the majority of this presentation, but it's kind of a big concept, another one to write down, I think, but definitely one to mull over a little bit. And that is, when I talked about how we all have those all 34 strengths, right? They're ranked. Okay. So those ones at the very bottom, 30, 31, 32, they're really low, right? They're not in the strength category for sure. But they are not the weaknesses. I think that sometimes when we get started in the strengths culture or the strengths mindset in our own development or in the development of others, we start to think of the strengths in our lower list as weaknesses. I don't think that's the case. The more that I work with organizations and individuals, the more I have really started to adopt the mindset that our weaknesses are actually our strengths unmanaged. I'll say it one more time and kind of explain. I think our weaknesses are our strengths unmanaged. They typically happen to be those top 5. So if you are having trouble with a specific job function, or you're having trouble relating to another person, or you're having trouble really kind of moving forward with a project, I don't think it's because you are lacking necessarily in strengths that are really low on your list. I think it's typically because your top 5 are hanging out in the basement, and we're not really figuring out ways to bring them back up into that mature state and approach our problem in a way that allows our strengths to really help us get past it. And so I think that's important to mull over and think about, when you know maybe some weakness areas for you, per se. Look at your top 5, look at your strengths and how you can apply that to those areas that tend to be a little weak for you, and see if they can kind of help push you past that. So.
Okay, well that's it for this one. Check out more Fishbowls exclusively for the Small Giants community at smallgiants.org.